Just after sunrise in the northern suburbs of Cape Town, a delivery truck idles at the edge of a new residential block, waiting for clearance to enter. Its manifest is unremarkable. Prefabricated door frames, wiring harnesses, insulation panels, the standard materials that arrive on construction sites every morning. The foreman signs a tablet, the gate lifts, and the truck moves through the dust without anyone thinking about how predictable this moment feels. A suburban street takes shape this way. One shipment approved, another delayed. A third rerouted to a different contractor because a compliance check flagged a discrepancy in thermal rating codes. To the average resident who will eventually live here, the process appears natural, even banal. They imagine the city approving zoning, developers arranging financing, and builders executing blueprints. It rarely occurs to anyone that the sequencing of these steps, who builds first, who waits, who gets materials delivered on time, and who faces unexplained postponements, depends on a deeper layer of authorization that operates far from the construction site. That layer lives not in headlines, but in allocation matrices, infrastructure compatibility thresholds, and quietly updated routing rules that determine which projects receive operational priority. The people buying homes will never notice the timing of these decisions. They will only notice that some neighborhoods seem to rise overnight, while others linger as open plots for years. And beneath that difference lies an administrative architecture that feels too procedural to question, too technical to examine, and too ordinary to see. Unless you happen to know who configured the rules that make a simple morning delivery seem inevitable. We are accustomed to thinking of influence in terms that photograph well. The mayor at a groundbreaking ceremony, developers presenting glossy renderings to investors, national ministers announcing housing initiatives under camera lights. These are the gestures that shape the public imagination, the visible choreography of authority. Elections shift leadership. Budgets are debated in parliament. Real estate firms release statements about growth and opportunity. From the outside, it seems that these are the forces determining where homes will be built, who will qualify for them, and how quickly entire neighborhoods emerge from empty land. But the motions we recognize as power touch only the outer layer of the system. The mayor does not write the sequencing logic that decides which parcels enter the pipeline first. The minister does not update the interoperability criteria that decide which developers are eligible for accelerated permitting. Even large construction companies, with their capital and influence, operate inside a framework they do not design. Their bids are submitted into procedural structures that long predate them. Structures built from compliance thresholds, procurement benchmarks, supply chain accreditation protocols, and routing templates for materials distribution. These technical layers move slower than politics, but exert more gravitational pull. A new housing initiative might promise 10,000 units, but the actual pace of construction will hinge on administrative matrices buried in agencies few residents can name. A developer might hold land, financing, and architectural plans, yet still find that their project advances only when a certain compatibility audit marks it as aligned with underlying coordination rules. Public figures carry the narrative. Visible companies carry the risk. But the mechanism itself, the quiet filtering of which projects advance and which remain suspended, rests in a procedural domain that escapes attention precisely because it presents itself as neutral infrastructure. It does not claim power, does not seek credit, does not make declarations. It simply defines the environment in which every visible actor must operate. The earliest traceable emergence of the Halden Syndicate does not begin with land ownership, political favor, or even construction expertise, but with a seemingly peripheral administrative concession granted during a period of rapid suburban expansion in the late 20th century, when Cape Town's northern outskirts began transforming from farmland into residential corridors. The city faced a logistical burden few departments were equipped to handle, aligning developers, utility providers, and material suppliers under a single sequencing framework that prevented grid overload and supply bottlenecks. Most firms saw opportunity in the building itself. The Haldens, then operating as a small technical consultancy from a rented office above an accounting firm, saw opportunity in the coordination. They volunteered for a role no one else wanted, validating interoperability between project timelines, supplier routing plans, and municipal infrastructure readiness. It was not glamorous work. It involved cross-referencing load forecasts, assessing whether roads could sustain construction traffic, checking whether sewer expansion matched projected housing density. But in this administrative clutter, they discovered an unclaimed niche, the power not to authorize development, but to determine when it became technologically feasible. Their approach was shaped by one guiding rule that became the syndicate's core principle across generations. Never hold the surface of control. They did not buy land. They did not attach their name to building companies. They avoided public tenders that required brand visibility. Instead, They embedded themselves inside the calibration layer, offering frameworks that municipalities adopted simply because they reduced risk. By the 1990s, their coordination templates were the default reference points for scheduling suburban rollouts, not through decree, but through repetition. Contractors followed them because insurance providers required compatibility. Insurance providers required them because lenders indexed risk to compliance with those templates, and lenders adopted them because the Haldens had quietly helped draft early versions of the city's infrastructure harmonization guidelines. No manipulation, no spectacle, just a quiet alignment of procedures that made their continued presence functionally indispensable. Over time, their consultancy dissolved into a network of advisory entities, each nominally independent but sustained by shared methodology. The name Halden rarely appeared on anything. The logic they designed appeared everywhere. As Cape Town's suburbs continued their outward expansion, the Halden architecture grew not through acquisition or visibility, but through incremental procedural embedding. Their early coordination templates evolved into a suite of compatibility frameworks used by municipal departments to reduce delays between zoning approvals and infrastructure activation. Contractors found that adhering to Halden-aligned sequencing models streamlined inspections. Suppliers discovered that their logistics software integrated more easily when referencing Halden origin routing logic. Lenders issued fewer compliance queries when project timelines matched the syndicate's risk-weighted rollout schedules. None of this resembled control in the traditional sense. It looked like technical convenience. Yet each adoption created another layer of dependence. A housing project seeking early access to utility corridors would need to provide documentation prepared using Halden-derived formatting. A developer aiming for accelerated permitting would be required to submit a feasibility matrix whose scoring system matched the thresholds originally drafted by a Halden affiliate. Over time, entire categories of certification, materials readiness checks, infrastructure load projections, supplier reliability indices, became indexed to procedural definitions that no longer had a visible author. The city would publish updated guidelines, but the underlying logic remained unchanged because altering it would require reconfiguring the entire administrative ecosystem surrounding suburban development. Even subcontractors, unaware of the system's origins, defaulted to using Halden-style documentation because alternative formats triggered slower reviews. The more that standards multiplied, the more invisible the original designers became. Their influence did not express itself through decisions, but through the absence of friction for those who aligned with their frameworks. A project that followed Halden-compatible schedules moved smoothly. A project that tried to deviate encountered mismatched thresholds, incompatible supplier timelines, or unqualified certification bodies. No one interpreted this as pressure. It felt like procedure. And as new suburbs rose, each dependent on synchronized supply chains and predictable infrastructure activation, the Halden logic embedded itself deeper into the city's development rhythm, not through authority, through inertia, not through ownership, through relevance. Over decades, the network's footprint broadened until it no longer resembled a consultancy at all, but a dispersed lattice of technical validators, scheduling brokers, compliance auditors, and logistics harmonization units, none of which claimed power, yet all of which shaped the order in which new homes became real. The turning point arrived not through scandal or political upheaval, but through a confluence of pressures that reshaped Cape Town's development landscape in ways no single institution had anticipated. The early 2000s brought a surge of internal migration, legislative reforms aimed at accelerating affordable housing, and a global shift toward just-in-time supply chains that left municipalities with little tolerance for procedural inefficiency. When a period of severe budget contraction intersected with rising demand, city departments found themselves unable to manage the sequencing complexities of suburban expansion without external frameworks that could reconcile infrastructure readiness, supplier availability, and financing constraints. Public agencies moved cautiously, constrained by procurement cycles and interdepartmental coordination rules. Developers tried to adjust, but the volatility of global materials markets meant that delays of even a few weeks could jeopardize entire projects. In this environment, Halden-aligned structures did not need to assert themselves. They were simply the only entities with existing procedural templates capable of stabilizing the workflow. Their risk-tiering matrices, originally designed for modest suburban rollouts, scaled seamlessly to higher pressure conditions. Their compatibility audits, once optional, became necessary because lenders required them as proof of project coherence during periods of funding volatility. Their scheduling logic, built around adaptive lead time buffers, minimized the impact of supply chain shocks that left other methods unusable. None of this appeared intentional. The crisis rewarded whatever systems demanded the least reconfiguration, and Halden frameworks were already embedded deeply enough that municipalities could adopt them without political resistance. As a result, the network's influence did not expand through design, but through circumstance. The more chaotic the environment became, the more attractive consistency appeared. Departments defaulted to Halden-compatible templates because deviating from them required technical recalibration they were no longer staffed to perform. Developers complied because lenders indexed risk to Halden-derived indicators. Suppliers aligned because the certification criteria for access to municipal corridors referenced Halden origin thresholds. The crisis did not elevate the Haldens. It elevated the architecture they had spent decades refining. And when the city emerged from the disruption, the procedural landscape had shifted permanently. No new policy announced it, no speech acknowledged it, but the conditions under which new homes could be built, the order, the feasibility, the timing, had silently reorganized themselves around a framework that had never been designed to be temporary. By the time Cape Town entered its next wave of expansion, the Halden presence had already begun dissolving into structures that no longer resembled a family or even a coordinated network. What remained were entities without narrative. A compliance foundation headquartered in Zurich, responsible for maintaining suburban rollout risk models. A South African logistics consortium administering supplier accreditation checks. A cluster of advisory units in Mauritius managing cross-jurisdictional scheduling protocols. A trust in Vancouver holding archival rights to early infrastructure harmonization datasets. None of these bodies advertised connection to one another, and none needed to. Their relevance came not from ownership, but from reference. Municipal guidelines cited compatibility thresholds maintained by the foundation. Lenders required matrices derived from the advisory units. Construction software defaulted to templates built atop the archival models. At some point, the last Halden descendant stepped away from an advisory board without notice, and nothing changed. The system no longer required lineage. It required continuity. Decision-makers became interchangeable, appointed through rotating committees that selected candidates for their technical neutrality rather than any allegiance. The structures updated themselves according to maintenance cycles embedded decades earlier. Definitions evolved through version control logs. Licensing conditions renewed automatically unless explicitly revoked, something no city had incentive to attempt, given the cost of recalibrating entire development ecosystems. In this environment, influence detached from biography. A suburban project manager requesting early activation of utility corridors interacted with dashboards and verification portals, never with people. A developer seeking sequencing approval engaged not with a syndicate, but with a rule set encoded across multiple jurisdictions, each revealing only the subset of logic necessary for its function. Even attempts to map the system produced only partial diagrams. A trust owning an algorithm here, a non-profit maintaining a training standard there, a certification body updating an audit format without fully understanding its origins. The Halden name had long since vanished from all public materials, yet the framework persisted with unbroken reliability, not because anyone defended it, but because every institution around it had grown to depend on its internal consistency. What had once been a family's quiet method for reducing friction in suburban rollouts had matured into a distributed procedural architecture that neither invited attention nor feared it. It survived not by secrecy, but by being too embedded, too practical, too structurally convenient to dislodge. It no longer mattered who had built it. It mattered only that it continued to run.